June 1944. The sky above the Philippine Sea burned with smoke and sunlight. Thousands of feet below, the ocean shimmered with the broken reflections of war oil slicks, floating wreckage, the glint of falling shells. A Japanese Zero, its guns empty, dove past a streak of flame that shouldn't still be flying, but it was. A Grumman F-6F Hellcat, its fuselage torn, one wing scorched, oil spewing from a shattered engine still clawed through the sky. Its pilot, Lieutenant Jack Dawson of the U.S. Navy, refused to bail. With one last burst, his gun stitched a line of tracers across the Zero's tail. The Japanese ace watched in disbelief as his own aircraft disintegrated mid-air, destroyed by a machine already half dead. Moments later, the Hellcat spiraled down into the sea, smoke trailing like a black ribbon. Japanese recovery teams would later find the wreck on a coral shore, armor melted, cockpit crushed, engine still intact. And when their engineers studied the wreckage, they discovered something that shattered years of pride. The enemy's new fighter was not just powerful, it was unkillable. By mid-1943, the Pacific had become a graveyard for aircraft. From Pearl Harbor to the Solomons, American pilots had faced the brutal precision of Japan's Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter so agile and deadly that few survived their first encounter. For nearly 2 years, the Zero reigned as the king of the skies. It was light, fast, and maneuverable, and in the early months of the war, the Japanese believed nothing could challenge it. But as the tide of war turned, the United States began to learn. American engineers at Grumman Aircraft, led by designer Leroy Grumman, studied every report, every pilot's testimony, every scrap of wreckage from downed Zeros. What they built in response was not just a fighter, it was a revenge machine. The new aircraft, designated F-6F Hellcat, rolled out in 1943. It was larger and heavier than its predecessor, the Wildcat. Many pilots doubted it at first. It didn't look elegant or sleek like the Zero. Instead, it looked like what truly was a blunt instrument of war. But inside its thick skin was a philosophy born from hard lessons. The pilot's life mattered more than speed. Grumman's team gave it armor plating to protect the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb gunfire without erupting, and a powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine that could keep running even when riddled with bullets. It was built not to dance, but to endure. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. Navy had its answer to the Zero. At Henderson Field, Marine and Navy pilots began transitioning from the Wildcat to the Hellcat. Many of them had already fought against Japan's best. They knew what had to be done: outlast, outgun, and outtrain. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders began to sense the change. At Rabaul, veteran pilots noticed new silhouettes cutting through the sky, bulkier, faster, with an engine roar that shook the air. The Hellcat could dive steeper, climb faster, and survive hits that would shred a Zero to pieces. But the true secret wasn't only in the machine. It was in the system that supported it. The United States was now fighting an industrial war. Aircraft carriers, maintenance crews, and replacement pilots flowed in endless supply. The Japanese Empire, by contrast, was bleeding dry. By late 1943, the Hellcat was fully operational aboard U.S. carriers. Squadrons like VF-9 and VF-15 carried the new fighter into combat across the Central Pacific. In its first 6 months, the Hellcat would destroy over 2,000 enemy aircraft, an astonishing record for a plane barely introduced to war. To the Japanese pilots, the shock was immediate. Their once invincible Zero could still turn tighter, but its days of dominance were ending. Every encounter with the Hellcat revealed a brutal truth. The Americans had built something different. It didn't rely on agility. It relied on survivability. The Hellcat could take punishment and keep flying. In cockpit after cockpit, Japanese airmen began reporting impossible sightings of Hellcats flying with holes through their wings, trailing fire, still returning home. At first, it was dismissed as an exaggeration. But by 1944, those stories became undeniable. And as the U.S. Navy pushed westward, one island at a time, Japan's Air Command faced a haunting question. How do you defeat an enemy who refuses to fall from the sky? That question would only grow louder in the months to come as the Hellcat met the Zero head-on in the largest carrier battle in history. To understand the Japanese reaction to the Hellcat, one must understand the myth of the Zero. When Japan entered the war in 1941, The Mitsubishi A6M0 was not merely a weapon, it was a symbol of national genius. Lightweight, graceful, and unmatched in maneuverability, it embodied everything Japan believed about its warriors. Skill and spirit could triumph over material might. The aircraft had proven this across the Pacific, from the skies over Pearl Harbor to the battles of Wake Island, Java, and the Coral Sea. In the early months, Allied pilots described the Zero as untouchable. Its turn radius was unmatched, its range nearly double that of any Allied fighter, and its pilots veterans of China and Manchuria were among the finest aviators in the world. Japan's Navy called them the samurai of the sky, but by 1943 cracks had begun to appear in that legend. The Zero had been designed for offense, not survival. It lacked armor, and its fuel tanks were thin and unprotected, perfect for performance, fatal under heavy fire. When hit, the aircraft often erupted in flames instantly. Yet for years that design philosophy had worked because no opponent could reach them first. Then the Americans changed everything. As the Hellcat appeared over the Solomons, Rabaul, and later the Marshalls, Japanese pilots began to realize what they were facing was not just a new aircraft, it was a new approach to warfare. The Hellcat didn't try to outturn them. It outclimbed, outdove, and outlasted them. The once lightweight Zero now seemed fragile against a machine that could absorb punishment and keep fighting. At Truk Lagoon, Japan's major forward base, officers collected reports from returning pilots. One described firing repeated bursts into a Hellcat's fuselage only to watch it continue climbing, its engine still roaring. Another swore he saw an American plane with its wing half burned still landing safely on a carrier. These accounts reached the desks of Japan's Air Command, where disbelief turned to concern. Could American engineering truly have surpassed their legendary fighter? Japanese engineers began gathering wreckage of downed Hellcats when possible. Some pieces washed ashore on the Caroline and Mariana Islands. Others were recovered after crashes. The findings shocked them. Thick armor plate around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks made of layered rubber and treated fabric, reinforced landing gear that could absorb brutal carrier impacts. Everything the Zero lacked, the Hellcat had in abundance. But what alarmed Japanese strategists most wasn't the aircraft's toughness, it was how many the Americans could produce. By 1944, Grumman's factories on Long Island were turning out nearly 600 Hellcats a month. Japan could barely manage a fraction of that output. The Imperial Navy, which had once prided itself on quality over quantity, was now drowning under the weight of American industry. As the months passed, Japan's air losses mounted. At Rabaul, at Kwajalein, and then in the Marianas, experienced pilots were being replaced by rushed trainees. The quality of Japan's air arm eroded rapidly, while the Americans improved theirs through relentless training and advanced technology. The stage was set for an air battle unlike anything the world had seen, a clash that would determine the fate of Japan's naval aviation once and for all. And when that day came, the Japanese would finally witness up close what made the Hellcat a weapon of legend. For engineers at Grumman Aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat was not born from theory, it was born from losses. Every burned-out Wildcat retrieved from Guadalcanal, every pilot debriefed after a fight with a Zero, told the same story. The American fighter could not match Japan's agility. But it didn't have to. Grumman's designers, many of them engineers with naval combat experience, knew the U.S. Navy needed a weapon that could absorb damage and keep flying. A plane that gave the pilot a second chance to live. In an age when survival often meant returning to fight another day, durability was the ultimate weapon. At the heart of this philosophy was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, a 2,000 horsepower radial beast. Unlike liquid-cooled engines of other fighters, the radial design could take hits without catastrophic loss. Even if several cylinders were shot out, the rest would keep the propeller turning. That meant the Hellcat could limp home, smoke trailing, engine coughing but alive. Wrapped around that engine was real armor. Steel plating behind the cockpit shielded the pilot from cannon fire. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, layered with treated rubber that swelled when hit by hot fuel or incendiary rounds, automatically closing small leaks. The canopy was thick, visibility clear. The undercarriage was strong enough to survive carrier landings that would crumple other planes. Every element of its design spoke the same language. survivability. But the Hellcat's advantage didn't end at engineering, it extended into how it fought. By 1943, American naval aviators had developed entirely new combat doctrines. They learned from the Zero's dominance and rewrote the rules of engagement. Instead of turning into battles, they fought in vertical spirals. Instead of dogfighting for position, they struck from altitude with brutal, precise dives. The U.S. Navy trained pilots to use the Hellcat's superior climb rate and firepower 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns to unleash devastating boom-and-zoom tactics. At training bases in Florida, California, and Hawaii, new naval aviators studied diagrams of the Zero's weaknesses: poor dive acceleration, fragile construction, lack of armor. Simulators drilled one mantra: never turn with a Zero. By the time a pilot earned his carrier wings, he didn't just know how to fly, he knew how to fight like a tactician. Meanwhile, in Japan, pilot training has grown desperate. Early in the war, Japan's aviators underwent years of intense selection. Only the best survived to fly. But by 1944, losses were so severe that the Imperial Navy accelerated programs months instead of years. New pilots went into combat with barely enough flight hours to land safely, much less fight. The difference showed immediately. Hellcat squadrons, often led by aces who had survived Guadalcanal and Midway, tore through formations of inexperienced Zero pilots. The U.S. The Navy had not only built a better plane, it had built a better system to sustain it. The Hellcat's operational environment also gave it another unseen edge: carrier warfare efficiency. The aircraft's folding wings allowed it to be packed tightly on carrier decks, maximizing numbers in each strike group. Maintenance crews could replace damaged parts quickly, thanks to standardized components and rugged simplicity. In the Pacific heat and salt air, reliability was survival, and the Hellcat was legendary for it. Even when the aircraft was hit, reports came in of pilots landing on carriers with holes the size of fists through their wings. In one case, during a mission over the Marshall Islands, a Hellcat returned to the USS Essex with 200 bullet holes. Its landing gear jammed, its control cables frayed, but it made it back. The pilot stepped out shaking but alive. This durability became a psychological weapon in itself. Japanese gunners, accustomed to seeing their hits ignite enemy planes instantly, were demoralized by the sight of Hellcats shrugging off gunfire. The Zero, built for agility and faith in the pilot's spirit, faced a machine built on cold logic and steel endurance. It was a clash of philosophies, the spiritual against the mechanical, precision versus mass production. And slowly, inevitably, the mechanical won. But beyond machines and tactics, another transformation was taking place. The pilots themselves, American and Japanese, began to feel the emotional weight of what this new phase of war meant. For every Japanese ace who once flew with pride, there was now frustration and disbelief. For every American pilot who once feared the Zero, there was now confidence, even pity. The Hellcat had done more than change the air war. It had changed how men felt when they looked up at the sky. By early 1944, the Pacific skies had become an emotional battlefield, as much as a physical one. For Japanese pilots, the war had shifted from triumph to survival. The young men who once soared through China's blue horizons in the invincible Zero were now dying faster than Japan could train replacements. The Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a messenger of despair. Psychological reports gathered after the war, from captured diaries and surviving pilots, tell a quiet, devastating story. Many Japanese aviators described a deep creeping disbelief. They spoke of the enemy's planes that refused to fall, of bullets that seemed powerless, of battles where entire formations vanished against an enemy they could barely scratch. One wrote simply, "It is not skill now. It is machinery. The gods have left the sky." To the Americans, that same shift felt like justice. Pilots who had watched comrades die to the Zero's guns now flew with something new. The Hellcat was their armor, their vengeance, their salvation. It didn't just protect them physically, it transformed their morale. Knowing they could take hits and live changed how they fought. They flew longer, pressed harder, and took risks that once meant certain death. The contrast between the two sides was striking. The Japanese command still believed in the purity of courage and the notion that a pilot's spirit could overcome material odds. But America's leadership, under men like Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, believed in systems, logistics, and the science of overwhelming advantage. They were engineers of war, not poets of it. The difference showed in every strategic decision. While Japanese leaders debated honor and sacrifice, American planners built supply chains, trained mechanics, and rotated pilots for rest and recovery. Every returning pilot became an instructor, turning his experience into the next man's survival. Japan's structure allowed no such cycle. Veterans died in the cockpit, taking their knowledge with them. This widening gap between philosophy and practicality became fatal. By the time the Hellcat entered large-scale combat in 1944, the Japanese Air Force was a shadow of its former self. The Imperial Navy's elite units, such as the Tainan Air Group, had lost their aces. Those who replaced them flew with less training, inferior tactics, and haunted eyes. In combat, the moral contrast was almost unbearable. Hellcat pilots often described watching Zeros burn light, fragile, consumed in seconds. Many felt pity. Some even feel guilty. One U.S. Navy pilot, Ensign George C. Duncan, wrote in his notes, "They come at us brave, fearless, and they die before they reach firing range. There's no satisfaction left in killing them." The war that had once been fought for glory had become a grim exercise in survival and industrial momentum. For Japanese leadership, reality was finally setting in. Admiral Mainichi Koga, Yamamoto's successor, received numerous field reports in 1944 warning of catastrophic pilot losses. He understood the numbers, but tradition held him back. To admit defeat in the air was to admit failure in the Empire's spirit. Orders continued to demand aggression, even in hopeless conditions. American intelligence soon intercepted communications revealing Japan's growing desperation. Messages described enemy aircraft that continued to fly while burning, and pleas for new designs capable of withstanding equal punishment. But Japan's factories were being bombed, its resources dwindling. Every Hellcat that rose from a carrier deck was a reminder of something Japan could no longer match the power to replace what was lost. And so, as the Americans advanced, a transformation occurred in Japanese strategy. When pilots could no longer survive to win, commanders began asking them to die to inspire. The seeds of the kamikaze were already taking root not purely from fanaticism, but from despair at facing an enemy that refused to break. The Hellcat didn't create that shift alone, but it symbolized it. Its arrival in the Pacific forced Japan's air arm to confront a truth they had long denied, that courage without means was suicide. To the Americans, the Hellcat represented the maturity of their war machine. To the Japanese, it was the omen of the war's end. And as the summer of 1944 arrived, that omen took shape over the Philippine Sea in a battle that would annihilate the last strength of Japan's naval air power. June 19, 1944. The morning sun rose over the Philippine Sea, casting gold light across the decks of 15 American carriers. The largest naval air armada in history was preparing for battle. Far to the west, steaming eastward from the Marianas, the Japanese combined fleet advanced to meet 430 aircraft, the last major air power Japan could assemble. The Imperial Navy called it Operation Ago, their desperate attempt to crush the American landings at Saipan. But the men of the U.S. Fifth Fleet called it something else: the day the enemy's air force would die. On the flight deck of the USS Lexington, pilots strapped into their Grumman F-6F Hellcats. The air smelled of fuel and salt, the metallic tang of carrier life. Deck crews gave thumbs up, props began to spin, and engines roared like thunder rolling across the Pacific. Each aircraft was armed, fueled, and ready. Not elegant, not graceful, but unstoppable. At 10 a.m., radar operators aboard the carrier USS Enterprise picked up the first incoming waves of hundreds of Japanese planes, stretched thin across the sea, heading straight for the fleet. The battle began not with sight, but with sound. Bandits, bearing 320 degrees, Angels 15. From the carriers, Hellcats launched in rapid succession. Within minutes, the blue sky was alive with silver flashes and black bursts of flak. The Japanese came in 4 main waves. Their fighters Zeros and J-2M Raidens escorted dive bombers and torpedo planes. But the American pilots were waiting. What followed was one of the most one-sided aerial slaughters in history. The Hellcats climbed high, diving down in controlled fury. Each attack run was disciplined, precisely a testament to training and technology. The first Japanese wave disintegrated within minutes. American pilots, flying faster and armed with 650 caliber machine guns, tore through enemy formations. Shells ripped through thin Zero fuselages, igniting them in orange fireballs that tumbled toward the sea. Lieutenant Alex Frasiu, of VF-16, downed 6 enemy aircraft in a single sortie, all within 8 minutes. His gun camera footage would later show burning silhouettes falling like meteors across the horizon. Radio chatter filled the air. Scratch one coming in on another. Watch the flak, he's smoking but still flying. Every American voice carried a confidence that hadn't existed 2 years earlier. The Japanese pilots fought bravely, many to the death, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Poorly trained replacements, limited fuel, and obsolete aircraft met the full power of the Hellcat generation. In the first 2 hours, over 250 Japanese planes were destroyed. Only a handful made it close enough to release their bombs, and even fewer hit anything. The U.S. losses were almost negligible. When the smoke cleared that afternoon, the Americans had lost fewer than 30 aircraft, many to flak or landing accidents rather than enemy fire. The sea below was littered with oil slicks and floating debris, the remnants of Japan's last trained air crews. It was later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a cruel nickname perhaps, but it reflected the cold, overwhelming truth. The era of Japanese air superiority had ended in a single day. Yet amid the triumph, something darker was being realized by those who watched the battle unfold. Japan's pilots were not beaten because they lacked courage. They were beaten because they faced a machine designed to erase courage's advantage. The Hellcat's presence in the sky had become psychological warfare. Japanese aviators now entered combat expecting death. Americans entered expecting victory. That imbalance of belief was as destructive as any weapon. As the sun began to set, the horizon glowed red fire and clouds blending into a haze of victory. Aboard the carriers, deck crews pulled shot-up Hellcats from the elevators, counting bullet holes like scars of survival. Some aircraft had returned with landing gear jammed, wings shredded, or engines coughing smoke. Yet they were proof that Grumman's Iron Works had fulfilled its promise. When the last plane landed, Admiral Mitcher looked over the results. Japan's elite aviators are gone. Its carriers were stripped of protection. Its Zero obsolete. The Pacific's air war had turned a corner. From this day on, Japan would never again threaten American naval air power. But what came next would go beyond tactics or machines. The following morning, when Japanese engineers recovered the wreck of a downed Hellcat along the island chain, they finally understood the scale of what they were facing and why their empire's wings had burned away. The next morning, across the scattered islands of the Marianas, the smoke of battle had thinned into a gray horizon. On one of those islands, half jungle, half shattered airfield, a Japanese recovery team stumbled upon the wreckage of an American fighter. Its blue paint was blistered by fire, its wings twisted and half buried in coral sand. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. Another enemy aircraft downed in the chaos. But when the engineers approached, silence fell. The symbol on the fuselage, a white star in a blue circle, was still visible. A Hellcat. For months, the Japanese Navy had whispered about this machine, the American fighter that seemed indestructible, the one that could dive steeper, climb faster, and still return home full of bullet holes. Now, for the first time, one lay before them. Lieutenant Commander Masao Taniguchi, an aeronautical engineer from Yokosuka, knelt beside the wreck and brushed the soot from its wing root. His fingers paused. The metal didn't feel like anything he'd seen on a Zero. It was heavier, thicker, and almost brutal in its design. He called for his notebook. They pried open panels, cut wires, and examined what little remained intact. What they found left them speechless. The Hellcat's armor plating was layered in a way that defied their design philosophy. American engineers build like they fear losing pilots, Taniguchi murmured. His assistant, a young officer named Kuroda, replied softly, ours build like we cannot afford the metal. Inside the shattered cockpit, the team found a cracked bulletproof windshield an inch and a half thick, and seat armor strong enough to stop a 20mm shell. The controls, though damaged, revealed a level of ergonomic logic unheard of in Japanese designs. Even the fuel tanks were a revelation. Self-sealing, lined with rubber and mounted behind armor bulkheads. When hit, the tanks had melted inward, sealing themselves instead of exploding. It explained everything. Why their pilots had reported American fighters trailing smoke but never burning. why the Zero's 7.7-meter round seemed to do nothing. Taniguchi stared at the bullet holes punched into the fuselage, each one a failed attempt to kill the man inside. He didn't need a report to tell him what this meant. For every Japanese pilot who took to the skies, the margin for survival had now vanished. By midday, officers from the nearby Air Command arrived to inspect the wreck themselves. One colonel, pale from exhaustion, asked bluntly, "Could we build such a machine?" Taniguchi hesitated. "Not with the metal we have. Not with the fuel we have left. And not with the time the Americans have already gained." The colonel said nothing. He looked at the twisted Hellcat, then toward the horizon where American carriers prowled unseen beyond the clouds. His silence said everything. Later that afternoon, they recovered a fragment of the engine cowling still bearing the faint letters F6F. The mechanics were astonished at the sheer size of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. 18 cylinders, more than 2,000 horsepower, twice the output of most Japanese aircraft engines. "How can they even fuel such a monster?" one man whispered. Taniguchi gave a tired smile. "Because they have oil, and factories, and time." For a long moment no one spoke. The air was hot and still, the sound of distant artillery echoing from Saipan. Each man there knew, even if the high command didn't yet admit it, that Japan's technological war had been lost long before its battlefields. That night, Taniguchi returned to the command tent and wrote his report by lantern light. He described the Hellcat's structural strength, its redundant controls, its self-sealing systems, and its unmatched engine reliability. Then he ended with a single line. "This aircraft is not designed to fight with honor. It is designed to survive, and that, gentlemen, is why we cannot defeat it." The report was sent to Tokyo. Some officials read it, nodded grimly, and filed it away. Others dismissed it as defeatism. But the pilots didn't need documents to tell them what they already knew. Every time a Hellcat appeared over the Pacific, they felt the same sinking certainty that this machine had been built to erase them from the sky. In the months that followed, the name Hellcat would become a whispered curse among surviving Zero squadrons. They spoke of its growl before an ambush, of tracer lines that seemed to bend toward their wings, of American pilots who fought like men protected by fate itself. By the time the sun set on 1944, the Imperial Navy's air arm was gone, consumed not by numbers alone, but by a philosophy of engineering that valued endurance over elegance. And somewhere, on a lonely island in the Pacific, the burned-out wreck of that first captured Hellcat remained a silent monument to the moment Japan realized that courage, no matter how pure, could no longer match the steel wings of industry. Tokyo, August 1944. Inside the shadowed halls of the Naval Air Technical Department, reports lay scattered across long oak tables. The air was thick with smoke and silence. A dozen engineers and officers stood over the torn blueprints of the Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's most celebrated fighter now facing its quiet death. Lieutenant Commander Taniguchi's report on the captured Hellcat had finally arrived. It was stamped confidential for senior staff only. But within days, copies were circulating through naval academies and air research bureaus. Each page felt like a confession. The Hellcat's armor thickness, engine specifications, and performance under damage were laid bare. To the untrained eye, it was a technical document. But to the men who had spent years perfecting the Zero's speed and grace, it read like an obituary. Admiral Minichi Koga, the Navy's air operations chief, read the report twice before speaking. "The Americans have built a fortress, not a plane," he said quietly. "And we still build swords with wings." Around him, the engineers exchanged uneasy glances. For years, Japan's aerial doctrine had rested on the myth of maneuverability, that superior pilot skill could overcome inferior protection. But the Hellcat had changed the rules. When a Zero met a Hellcat, the outcome was no longer a duel. It was a collision of eras. One engineer stood and spoke nervously. "If we add armor and thicker tanks, the Zero loses its agility." Koga nodded. "Then perhaps agility no longer matters." That single remark carried the weight of a funeral bell. Across Japan's research facilities in Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Kure, the shift was immediate but hopeless. Plans began for new aircraft, the A7M Repu, Strong Gale, and the N1K Shiden. They were to be Japan's answer to the Hellcat being faster, heavier with armored cockpits and self-sealing fuel systems. but the nation no longer had the means to build them in numbers. By late 1944, American B-29s were hammering Japan's factories. Aluminum was scarce. High-octane fuel was a luxury. And the pilots? Most were barely trained, sent into battle with less than 100 hours in the cockpit. The contrast was merciless. For every one new Japanese fighter that reached the front, America built 50. For every one skilled pilot Japan lost, America trained 10 more. The Imperial Navy's air wings once feared were now ghosts. Entire squadrons took off and never returned. And yet, even in despair, there was a quiet respect for the enemy. Reports circulated of Hellcats limping home with half their wings shot away, still flying straight. A pilot from the 343rd Kokutai later recalled, "We hit one again and again. It smoked, it burned, but it would not fall. That was the day I knew we could not win." In the command chambers of the Naval General Staff, strategy meetings turned somber. The question was no longer how to win, but how long to hold out. Rear Admiral Tatsuo Kuroiwa, an aviation strategist, proposed a desperate measure. If Japan could not outbuild the Americans, it would outdie them. Thus began the transformation of air strategy, from air superiority to sacrificial defense. The kamikaze doctrine emerged not from fanaticism alone, but from the hard arithmetic of industrial collapse. When a single Hellcat could destroy 4 or 5 Zeros, the only countermeasure left was human will. By October 1944, as Japan's last carrier groups were destroyed in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Hellcat's dominance became absolute. It flew in every theater escorting bombers, strafing airfields, and sinking ships. To Japanese radar operators, the distinctive growl of its engine was the sound of inevitability. Taniguchi, the engineer who had examined the downed Hellcat, watched the war unravel from a lab outside Tokyo. He received fragments of wreckage daily, twisted aluminum, burned steel, all that remained of Japan's final generation of fighters. He would turn them over in his hands and whisper, "Too light, always too light." The contrast haunted him. While Japan had sought perfection through agility and spiritual purity, America had sought durability and function, and in that difference lay the future of modern warfare. By winter, the command's desperation deepened. Meetings became rituals of denial. Reports were rewritten to sound optimistic. Diagrams of impossible prototypes covered the walls: jets, rocket planes, and hybrid engines. But behind the paper, everyone knew the truth. The war Japan had designed for the elegant duel of pilots in the sky no longer existed. It had been replaced by the mechanical war of factories, oil, and armor. And at the center of that transformation stood the Hellcat, a machine that embodied everything Japan could no longer match: power, protection, and endurance. The examination of that single-downed aircraft had not just revealed a machine, it had exposed an empire's illusion. The Zero's legend was over. The age of the invincible pilot had ended, and the world had entered the era of industrial air power, cold, relentless, and unstoppable. By early 1945, the Pacific skies no longer belonged to Japan. Once, they had been ruled by the graceful arcs of the Zero, a symbol of unmatched agility, and the warrior spirit of the Emperor's pilots. Now those same skies thundered with the heavy roar of American Hellcats, sweeping in endless formations from horizon to horizon. The transformation was absolute. From the Marianas to the Philippines and then to the Ryukyu Islands, the Hellcat reigned uncontested. Its pilots called it the Cat with 9 Lives. Japanese survivors gave it another name, the Blue Devil. Every new engagement told the same story. Hellcats appeared from the sun, dove through clouds of tracer fire, and tore through Japanese formations before they even knew what had hit them. Sometimes a dozen Zeros would rise from a base like Iwo Jima, and not a single one would return. American Navy records from 1944 to 1945 show a staggering ratio: 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost. No fighter in history had ever achieved such dominance. To the men on Japan's airfields, it was more than numbers. It was despair in motion. Fuel shortages meant half the planes couldn't take off. Replacement parts didn't exist. Young recruits, many still teenagers, were rushed into cockpits, told to protect their homeland against a machine their instructors had quietly admitted was unbeatable. An American Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, later described what it felt like to face the last remnants of Japan's air arm. They came at us bravely, but you could see they were green. It wasn't a fight anymore, it was mercy we didn't have time to give. For the Japanese, courage had become the only weapon left, and even that could not slow the tide. The Hellcat's strength wasn't just its firepower, though its .650 caliber Browning machine guns could shred anything in the sky. Its true advantage was survivability. It could take hits, lose power, or even catch fire and still make it home. Pilots often returned to carriers with wings ripped by shrapnel, engines coughing smoke, canopies cracked and blackened. Mechanics would count the bullet holes, patch them, and send the plane out again within hours. It was a flying embodiment of industrial resilience, a reflection of a nation that had mastered the art of producing destruction faster than war could consume it. Meanwhile, Japan's skies grew quieter. By March 1945, when the firebombing of Tokyo began, the once proud Imperial Navy Air Service was effectively gone. Those few planes that remained were scattered, hidden, or preserved for suicide missions. Hellcats now flew escort for B-29 superfortresses on deep penetration raids across the home islands. They strafed airfields, sank transport ships, and hunted down any sign of resistance. To American naval planners, it was no longer about air superiority. It was about total air domination. The surviving Japanese pilots fought with heartbreaking resolve. Many had watched friends vanish into the sea, consumed by tracer fire. Others had flown knowing they had no fuel to return. Yet even in their final days, they remained honorable opponents. American pilots often remarked that despite the hopelessness, their adversaries never broke formation, never fled. In the end, the sky itself became their tomb. By the time U.S. forces reached Okinawa in April 1945, the Hellcat was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol of a turning world. It represented the end of the romantic age of flight and the beginning of industrial air warfare. Cold, efficient, and relentless. And for the men who once flew the Zero, the truth was impossible to escape. They had been overtaken not by bravery, but by evolution. By the summer of 1945, the Hellcat's shadow stretched across every ocean wave between the Philippines and Tokyo Bay. It had fought in every major battle, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima, and left a trail of wreckage across the Pacific that told one story: Japan's skies no longer belonged to Japan. On aircraft carriers like the USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Essex, the Hellcat had become a symbol of routine dominance. Pilots no longer wondered whether they would return, only how many enemy planes they would down before they did. In war rooms aboard the Pacific Fleet's flagships, planners studied maps that were now little more than lists of coordinates awaiting destruction. Every island, every airfield, every convoy route, all of it, was under the blue watch of the Hellcat wings. The once feared Japanese air defenses had been reduced to a tragic spectacle. Pilots barely out of flight school launched in outdated Zeros, many without radios or training in formation flying. They faced squadrons of Hellcats guided by radar, coordinated by advanced carrier control systems, and protected by overwhelming firepower. Even so, the Japanese pilots did not surrender their courage. As the war drew to its final months, they found a new purpose: to die in defense of their homeland. Thus began the final act, the kamikaze offensive. Hellcat pilots now faced not dogfights but guided death. In the skies above Okinawa, waves of suicide planes hurled themselves at the American fleet. It was warfare stripped to its most brutal essence, technology against human will. An American pilot recalled later, "You didn't want to shoot them. But if you hesitated, men died. There was no victory in that sky, only survival. And survive they did." The Hellcat's speed, armor, and steady control allowed its pilots to intercept hundreds of kamikaze attackers before they reached the fleet. It became the shield of the Pacific, the wall between the last fury of Japan and the men waiting below. By war's end, the numbers were beyond comprehension. Over 12,000 Hellcats had been built. They had destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, an unmatched record in aviation history. The U.S. Navy credited the Hellcat with 75% of all aerial victories achieved in the Pacific theater. And when Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, it was under skies once filled with their own Zeros, now patrolled by the machines that had replaced them. In Tokyo, the surviving engineers who had studied that first downed Hellcat in 1944 watched the ruins of their cities smolder. Among them, Lieutenant Commander Taniguchi returned to his notes the report that had predicted everything. He was not bitter. He was silent. The war had ended exactly as his examination had warned, a nation defeated by metal, oil, and the mathematics of survival. The Hellcat, meanwhile, was retired quietly. There were no parades, no grand farewells. It had done its work brutally, efficiently, without glamour. Many were scrapped, some sold for training, others left to rust on forgotten runways. But for the men who flew them, the bond was eternal. Pilots spoke of the Hellcat as if it were alive, a machine that understood fear and bore it for them. One Navy veteran later said, "It didn't fly beautifully. It fought beautifully." As Japan began its long recovery, a strange irony emerged. Former engineers who once studied the Hellcat's wreckage would later work alongside American experts in rebuilding Japan's aviation industry. The lessons of that machine, its simplicity, resilience, and power would become the foundation for Japan's own rebirth in engineering and industry. In the end, the Hellcat had done more than win a war. It